Lex Luthor pulled a gun on me and he said stop doing that, and I said Lex, drop the gun or you will force my Predator killer armor to activate, and then the eyes of my armor flashed silver for a second and my armor decloaked and went visible, and then all my shoulder mounted laser cannons activated, and then Lex Luthor said okay fine, I dropped the weapon, don't shoot, what the hell kind of armor is that and what the hell are you, and I said I already told you that, now calm down, and he said transform back into a human please before I lose it, and then I said don't you tell anyone about this Lex, especially your father, because I know he will try to capture me and that is a bad idea because of my Predator killer armor, and Lex said what kind of armor is that because it looks like it's alive, and I said it's the latest in nanotechnology on my home planet, my mother sent it with me and that's what my gauntlet is for, it has all my deadly weapons and tech inside it and it activates automatically when my life is in danger and my armor is indestructible, it even has force field technology, and Lex said incredible, you can talk English and you must be a shapeshifter, and I said yes I am, I can even transform into a beautiful woman and have children just like a female if I wanted to, although I prefer to have sex with women not men, and he said okay now I am interested, show me please, and then I transformed into a beautiful blonde white female with a curvy figure and a perfect body, and Lex Luthor said oh my god that's incredible, and then I said feel them, I know you want to, and then he walked up and touched my boobs and he said remarkable, they feel amazing, so you have female sex organs and everything, and I said yes sir, I even have a vagina right now, and he said really you're very beautiful in that form, and I said yes I know, but I use these primitive forms to blend in instead of my natural appearance that humans seem to be terrified of, and then Lex said okay can I have sex with you in that form, and I said no sir not right now, I don't even know you that well buddy and I am still a man, and he said okay I understand, but after everything you just told me I assumed that you were both male and female, and I said yes I am, and then Lex said I'm confused, and I said I am not having sex with you, find someone else besides, you saw my true form, what do you think will happen to you if you piss me off, and he said good point, and I said remove your hands please, and he said I'm sorry it's a habit, and I said it's okay, it feels good when I'm in this form, and he said are you sure you don't want to have sex with me right now, and I said yes I am sure, and then I turned back into Clark Kent, and Lex said that female form could be very useful, can you change your voice to sound like a woman, and then I used my female voice, and I said yes Lex Luthor I can do that, and he said oh my god that's freaky, you sound just like a regular human woman and sexy too, and I said this is getting very weird and awkward, and he said dude you made it weird after everything you just told me about yourself, of course I am going to look at you differently now, who do you call that woman that you transform into, she's beautiful and curvy and even bit toned and muscular, she's gorgeous, and I said I saw her in magazine once on another alien planet, and then Lex Luthor said I would like to see that form again very soon, and please if my father ever sees you with me romantically pretending or whatever, could you please not have sex with that old fart, and I said your father is a criminal Lex, he's not a good man, in fact the only reason he has his business is because he killed your grandparents on your father's side of the family anyway, and then I said I am glad you mentioned repaying me for saving your life, I definitely want to take you up on that offer, and I wanted to ask you for about $5 million or at least $2 million if that's possible, and he asked me why, what do you need it for, and I said it's nothing, it's to help my father and his farm, Jonathan Kent is my adoptive father and my parents need help, and then Lex said please transform back into that beautiful blonde woman again please, and I transformed back into the beautiful white Nubian blonde woman that's curvy and muscular, and I said in my female voice okay are you happy now, I don't like being in this vulgar form, and he said turn around, and I said what, and he said turn around please, I want to see everything, and then I scowled and said fine, and then he said amazing, now that is a beautiful, but your body is perfect in that form, and I said why is it that humans think about sex all the time, and he said well I could give you the $5 million, but he smiled lewdly and said it's a bit steep but I can make a deal with you, and I said you have no shame, don't even think about it, and he said I'm sorry Clark Kent, you really shouldn't have showed me that form, and then he said I will give you the $5 million in cash and everything.